Hi. Are you a Nazi? I know nowadays it's a bit of an overused term, since it seems to be referred to both anyone who's ever dropped a ballot for a Republican and also for anyone who's vegetarian or feminist, for instance. In the strict sense of the term, you could say that the only real Nazis were the people who actually belonged to the NSDAP, the National-Socialist Party of Germany, that has now been dissolved and doesn't exist, so nobody can really be a true Nazi anymore. However, we could also consider that anybody who adheres to that ideology could be considered a Nazi as well. And so that would include basically all those who think that German people in particular are superior, and then maybe more generally, pan-Germanic people, and maybe even just most European people, and also that have a dislike for non-Europeans and for Jews, and think that, something should actively be done about, eliminating these less desirable ethnicities from European person territories. Now, there are quite a few people who have that kind of an ideology, but it's important to note that most of them probably wouldn't advocate something as drastic as the Holocaust, and still these people represent a minority of the population in most countries, probably. But what I want you to realize is that it really depends on, your threshold for what constitutes a Nazi in that case. Because, well, what is Nazi? I mean, Nazi is a shorthand for National-Socialist, National-Socialist, right? It's just the first two syllables of National. So it's actually just an abbreviation of National, which of course then is linked to Socialist. So it's actually an abbreviation of Nationalists, which means an abbreviation of nationalist. Nazi means nationalist, okay? So, and in fact, what I want you to realize is that that is very much an issue. Nationalism is a bad thing. And why is nationalism a bad thing? Well, because it means that you actually prefer your own nation to others. What that means is that you actually will be willing to support policies that benefit the people within your own nation at the expense of other people. It literally means that you don't believe in equality, that you believe that it's okay to do bad things to other people if it does good things to you. That is fundamentally the tribalist mentality, which, like I've said in a previous post on the Jordan Peterson video, I explained that basically we have these three stages of human development. The stage 0 is where you're still at the animal stage, and there individuals have the goal of just gaining individual advantage at other individuals' expense. So they act in these sort of what I call chavvy ways, which is all about about trying to be dominant and aggressive. And this is especially the case for males because they're basically competing for access to mating with females. And that leads to all these sort of obnoxious, stereotypical masculine behaviors. Then what happens is that starting around roughly 2 million years ago, when humans started to really cooperate in tribes, for hunting and building tools and such, well, then suddenly they couldn't just be individualistic anymore. They also had to support the interest of their own tribe. And as a result, sometimes they actually had to fight their innate individualistic instincts for the benefit of their tribe. And because tribes who actually did that, tribes whose members were more cooperative within the tribe, well, they actually managed to outcompete the tribes whose members were more individualistic. And that's what gave rise to this phenomenon of having these sort of rigid cultural norms that people respect, even if sometimes it might not be beneficial at the individual level. What you have to understand is that these cultural norms are fundamentally irrational, right? Because these people that believe in them don't actually realize that they're doing it for the purpose of the survival of their tribe. They think these are actually good rules. They're ethically inherently good, which is not the case. And of course, one of the fundamental ideas that come with this is just, well, tribalism, the actual belief in, the superiority of one's tribe, and or at least the fact that one should definitely fight for one's tribe at the expense of other tribes. And this mentality is now reflected in nationalism. And of course, then, so that was stage 1, and that's this is what I call a perverted intermediate stage between animality and humanity. To me, it's something that never should have existed, because if people had been more rational, they would have realized that it would have been much more beneficial to just cooperate between tribes. But instead, well, there's something that made people just stick to this silly tribalism. And as a result, we've had all this terrible 2 million years of just idiocy and people fighting against each other and being subjected to all these repressive social norms, which just did not need to be the case. And so then I said that there's stage two, and that's the full human stage. And that's when you finally believe in universal ethics. That's when you finally believe in omnibenevolence, that you want the best for everyone, and you believe in equality for everyone. And simply because you recognize that that is better. And so nowadays, some modern countries have adopted some of these principles because these principles, well, they've been developed by, various thinkers over the past few centuries. And because people actually did manage to recognize that they're better, well, they got adopted into the mindset of many countries. So this is why we have things like democracy and individual freedom and the principle of equality. These are all very good things. But unfortunately, we're still very much stuck with these intermediate stage one mindsets, and in particular with this principle of nationalism. Nationalism is really part of what I call this, so stage one subhuman mindset, which is all about tribalism and not about universalism and about rationality. And so what you see is all these countries, starting with the USA, which was the first country to have a democracy, of course only for white men, but it was the first country to really be founded with this idea of implementing some of these stage two real human ideals, but at the same time it was still very much beset with stage one ideologies, in particular, well, already slavery. But even beyond the issue of slavery, just the very fact that the USA was founded with this idea of being a country that exists kind of in opposition to other countries, well, that is still stage one mindset, right? That's still tribalism, that's still inegalitarianism. And, well, because the United States was founded with these ideals, you could say that, in a way, the United States was, in a way, the best country on Earth at the time, and even for a long time afterwards, since, it still had that legacy of being the first and being kind of a pioneer in many ways for making things better. But even ignoring the terrible racism and sexism that pervaded American society when it was founded, well, just the very fact that it was a country, well, that was not something new. And that was really something that was still part of the same mindset that had been existing always up until that time. This idea that you live in a separate tribe and you try to advance the interests of your own tribe at the expense of others. And so in that sense, the existence of America as a separate country, well, that is not at all exceptional. And in fact, it stands in utter opposition to everything that makes the USA unique and better than other countries, right? So really, what I want to say is that America, as a separate country, America is un-American. If we were to develop the ideals that make America so good to their fullest extent, well, we wouldn't actually believe in having a separate country. We wouldn't believe in patriotism or nationalism. Rather, you'd want to spread those ideals everywhere. And that is not even particularly, radical. I mean, think about these missionaries. Christian missionaries wanted to spread Christianity everywhere, and they wanted everyone to be Christians precisely because they wanted to help everyone. They believed in universalism. They didn't want to just keep Christianity for their own group, and they didn't want to just kill other people who weren't Christians. No, they were happy to spread their religion. And, well, I'm very critical of all religions in general, but, I mean, Christianity is in fact universalist. And that's why it's rather ironic that all these very nationalistic people also often tend to claim that they're Christian. And in fact, well, no, Christianity is about universality. It's about equality between people. And of course, well, it's for the wrong reason, because it's all based around this idea of this god Yahweh, which is actually a very evil being. But ignoring that, it still doesn't really make sense to believe in nationalism when you had these missionaries that went all over the place to spread Christianity everywhere because we wanted everyone to be on the same level. And what's also ironic is all these, supposedly more tolerant, caring, liberal or leftist people that say, oh, we are fighting racism and everything, and they have all these affirmative action policies and everything. But at the same time, they say, we've got to defend our economic interests against other countries and stuff, and in particular China. And that's just nuts, because you're being racist. Except it's not quite racist because, okay, you say, well, if a Chinese person comes to the USA and becomes naturalized, well, then we'll actually support that person. But, like, okay, you're not being racist, you're being nationalist, which is just as bad. It's equivalent to being racist. It's like you're discriminating people based on the country that they're living in instead of their race, but, like, it's just as much tribalistic, it's just as discriminatory. So, like, this is nuts. And so we're seeing this not just with, like, Republicans who are often, accused of being racist, but Democrats who are doing this also. They're doing the same shit, okay? So, like, these Democrat people are utter hypocrites. And so, as I'm saying in the title of this video, well, even Bernie Sanders, who is now, like, considered so far left, despite just having policies that are pretty standard for the mid-20th century, well, that he's actually decried by the own Democratic Party for being, like, a commie, despite the fact that he's, like, not at all advocating for actual socialist policies. But he's still, like, considered too far left to belong to the Democratic Party, and even he is actually a Nazi in the sense of being a nationalist because he says he wants to defend the interests of the USA against other countries. He wants to restrict free trade so as to benefit American workers. But that is completely wrong. The average Chinese person earns about 1/6 as much as the average American person. So if anybody needs to be unfairly advantaged for now, it's China. Because Chinese people for now are much poorer than American people, and, like, they don't deserve to be poor. They didn't choose to be born in a poor country. They didn't, like, say, oh, well, I'm going to be poor because I like being poor. So why are you going to fight China? Why are you going to fight their very needed economic growth, while America, in comparison, is plenty rich and really just doesn't need at all as much to grow economically as China does? So that's it. If you believe in equality, well, you have to believe in equality everywhere, right? It makes no sense to just believe in equality for the people that happen to live within certain boundaries that you drew on a map. The reason people say they believe in equality, but then at the same time still promote nationalistic policies that are utterly inegalitarian, well, is that most people don't believe in equality. They just pay lip service to the notion, or they think that they believe in it, but they don't believe in it because they truly believe in equality. No, they're actually just selfish idiots who are tribalistic and who claim to believe in equality both out of selfishness and, perhaps most importantly, out of tribalism. And I think the latter is what best explains why so many Americans say that they believe in equality when, in fact, they don't. Most Americans don't believe in equality. Most Americans believe in severe inequality, and I'm saying Americans, but of course, in all other countries, the same thing. All other countries with the supposedly, modern egalitarian ideals, they actually don't believe in equality. Instead, they just pride themselves in believing in equality, and in particular in the United States, well, it's become a matter of national pride to believe in equality, because that is sort of one of the values that are associated with the USA. See, equality was one of the founding principles of the USA, and then the other countries that established democracy, right? Because democracy is largely an expression of the belief in equality. But as a result, people largely think they believe in equality because it's become now part of the culture and become part of the ideology of their tribe, that is the tribe that is called the USA. And so it's actually out of tribalism that they believe in equality. And tribalism is intrinsically inegalitarian. So it's actually out of inegalitarianism that people think they believe in equality. And that is honestly a disheartening notion. It means that people actually don't believe in equality, that there are really not many people who actually genuinely believe in equality. If you believe in equality, you have to believe it for everyone. Otherwise, that's not equality. That's just tribalism. And so this means that just this idea of having separate countries that compete against one another, well, that is wrong. That is tribalistic, and it's inegalitarian. And it's simply unethical, and it's simply evil. And what's ironic is, like, nowadays, even many of these sort of, socialist hippie people, they're actually often supporting this existence of separate countries. They're all about this sort of, national self-determination and crap. It's like, it's completely ridiculous, because that is not at all what socialism even was meant to be about. Socialism initially was internationalist, right? these socialist writers like Marx, they wanted global socialism precisely because they believed in equality among everyone. This idea of national self-determination is actually antithetical to socialism and communism and Marxism. Now, I do not support communism, Marxism, or socialism or whatnot. I do not support it because these are not realistic and efficient economic systems. However, I do support the globalist, internationalist ideals of socialism, absolutely. Because simply, well, if you actually believe in equality, if you actually care about everyone, you have to believe in such an ideal, entirely irrespectively of whatever economic policy you think is best. And in any case, I think globalism is also just a good policy economically. It actually helps the economy grow. It actually makes the economy more efficient by allowing certain regions to specialize in certain products, and therefore allowing to have more efficiency in the production of each particular product, and also allowing for economies of scale. Again, lots of these sort of idealistic hippie types, they want everybody to live in these small, isolated communities that largely even exist in autarky. But that's silly, because that's just going to reinforce tribalism, and on top of that, well, it's actually just economically inefficient, because having to do everything everywhere means that you won't be able to specialize as much, and that means that you won't have economies of scale, and it means that people are just going to be poorer. So I utterly oppose localism, I oppose national self-determination, I oppose everything that isn't globalism, both economically and politically. And if you actually believe in omnibenevolence, if you actually believe that we should strive to do the best for everyone, you have to also believe in globalism. Globalism is a great thing. Globalism is not just a great thing, it's a necessary thing. I believe that any civilization that isn't globalist is doomed to stagnate at the very least, and likely even to just self-destruct. As such, I consider it very important for the continued progress, and even for the mere survival of our species, to abandon all tribalism and to fully embrace globalism and universalism and omnibenevolence. That is what we need. And that is what I'm trying to promote. And in fact, Primo Levi, he's a Jew who survived the Auschwitz concentration camp and wrote a book about it. He explained very well that Nazism is actually just the logical conclusion of a nationalistic mindset. If you think that your people are better than others, well, it only makes sense that you should think that your people should be advantaged. And in fact, it even makes sense that there should be more of your people, and that there should be less of other people. And so it only makes sense that we should maybe get rid of those other people to make some room for your people, right? That is just a logical conclusion of a nationalistic mindset. See, to Primo and to me, the Nazi Party and the Nazi mindset and the Holocaust is just nationalists being consistent. The reason all these other nationalists didn't do the Holocaust is because they weren't being consistent. They never really developed their nationalistic ideology to their fullest extent. So, in fact, the reason that there aren't many more genocides than there are is not so much because people are all that good, but because they're actually irrational, and as such they're inconsistent. They have a kind of instinctive goodness and compassion which leads them to shy away from ideas of genocide in general, but they fail to realize that nationalism should in fact compel them to commit genocide whenever possible. See, nationalism is just utterly irrational because it relies on mistaken assumptions of the superiority of your race or nation. But from the moment that you decide to accept this, irrational premise that your nation is superior, well, then it's actually rational to go on to Holocaust all the other people. And in fact, we could say that much of the reason that the Holocaust was done by the Germans is that the Germans are actually more rational than most people. I mean, we know that Germans are sort of they're methodical, they're analytical, that's kind of why the economy in Germany works well. And, well, they're actually rational enough to recognize that the rational thing to do from the moment that you accept nationalism is to kind of just kill everyone else. Unfortunately, they weren't rational enough to see that, well, their premise was irrational, that their premise that Germans were superior was false and irrational. Now, you could argue that since it required extra rationality to come up with the Holocaust, the Germans maybe really were superior to other races, right? Of course, it's a bit silly because already, well, Ashkenazi Jews are known to be like the smartest race on earth. And so, okay, they were considered kind of corrupt, so maybe like the Germans were also just more sort of orderly and maybe more rational too, since they actually came up with the Holocaust and like the Jews didn't. But of course, the Jews couldn't because there weren't enough of them to do that. But obviously, like, they aren't really all that rational anyway, because, like, they didn't even realize why they really believed in this whole Jew and thing. I mean, because, like, this idea that Jews are responsible for the ills of society was ridiculous. So obviously, they aren't actually all that rational because they easily fell prey to such a conspiracy theory. So by and large, I don't think there's all that big of a difference in rationality between different races. I think there's just a lot of people in all races who are very irrational, unfortunately. So you know how they say a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing? Well, we could also say a little bit of rationality is a dangerous thing. If you're just partly rational, you might end up doing something like the Holocaust, where you apply irrational thinking to irrational premises, which arise from a more deep irrationality. So really, you know how there are all these people that like to conflate all leftism with Stalinism, right? Well, if they do that, you can absolutely conflate all nationalism with Nazism. In fact, there's more of a link between nationalism and Nazism than there is between leftism and socialism. Already, firstly, because much leftism actually just wants to keep capitalism anyway, so it's not even socialist. It's actually, in an absolute sense, it's actually more right-wing than left-wing. And then even just considering socialism. So socialism, okay, does tend to imply, though they don't necessarily realize it, it does tend to quite systematically imply the government takeover of the economy. But it doesn't inherently imply oppression and murder of the sort that was committed by Stalinism. On the other hand, nationalism, well, it does kind of say that your nation is better than others and that you should profit at others' expense. And so it actually means that you care about yourself more than about others. Socialism is about bringing equality to everyone, right? Nationalism is about inequality. And as such, well, socialism is not inherently harmful or murderous, quite to the contrary. Socialism, well, it wants to help everyone. That's part of the whole ideology, is to bring equality and fairness and just goodness to everyone. But the point is that it's a mistake, see? It's a flaw rather than a feature. It's an unintended consequence. Whereas, when you look at nationalism, well, if another country fails and you benefit from that failing, well, then you regard that as a good thing. And so from there, it really isn't all that much of a stretch to go and doing the Holocaust, right? Because, well, if they're inferior and they're less good, well, wouldn't you want everything to be good? I mean, if you believe in universalism, then you should believe that good should be expanded, exported everywhere, right? You should believe that there should be as much good as possible. That is what I believe in. And so, if you think that your nation, that your race, your ethnicity is better, then it only makes sense that you should want to spread it as much as possible. And therefore, well, genocide very much does derive naturally from nationalism. And this is why even just the kind of attitudes of economic self-interest that all these Democrats, including even someone like Bernie Sanders, are supporting, it just insidiously fuels an attitude that would logically lead people to end up supporting genocide. This is, above all, why we should virulently oppose even just the economic nationalism that is being defended by pretty much everyone in politics, whether it be Republicans, Democrats, or even supposed democratic socialists, who of course are not democratic socialists, but rather social democrats, who are actually not socialists, but capitalists, who just want a system that's a bit more fair. But obviously, they don't even care all that much about fairness, since they actually just want to defend their own country's interests above other countries. So we must oppose all of that. Anytime anyone says that we should promote a policy that benefits our country at other countries' expense, it's something absolutely odious that we absolutely have to oppose with the utmost virulence, okay? We have to make it clear that that is Nazi. That is the Nazi mindset. I used to think people brandish the term too easily, but now I really realize that, in fact, it makes sense to call all nationalists Nazis, and it's justified to oppose all nationalism with the same harshness that is typically reserved to the actual Nazi party. Now, just to make it clear and to assuage some fears that some people might have, when I say we should abandon nationalism, that does not mean that we should embrace multiculturalism. That does not mean that we should let ourselves just be completely swamped by all sorts of other cultures who themselves are ironically often very tribalistic and just irrational and inegalitarian and socially repressive. I'm not saying that at all. What I want is for everyone to abandon nationalism as a result of an adoption of universal rational values, especially omnibenevolence, the desire to do good to everyone, and then fairness, so, the desire that everyone be treated fairly, and also freedom, giving the people the right to do whatever they want as long as it doesn't directly harm someone else. And these are concepts that, by and large, these other cultures don't believe in. When we say that Western culture is sort of better than other cultures, because it believes more in those values than any other culture does. So really, for all these people who, sort of love this idea of the West and who are afraid of being taken over by other cultures, well, that is not at all what I'm suggesting. Quite to the contrary, it would be rather the ultimate instance of Western imperialism in a way, except it wouldn't be imperialism. It would just be spreading these values in the way that missionaries did for Christianity back in the day. But we'd really want them to be spread to such an extent that they'd really just be fundamentally ingrained in everyone, so that everyone on Earth would just be indistinguishable from anyone else. I don't mean that everybody would be literally identical in terms of personality, but that everyone would espouse the same rational values. As such, it wouldn't be like making America join some weird multicultural New World Order. No, it would be like making the entire world become America, or at least the good aspect of America, and eliminate all the bad stuff. What we would have is everybody believe in freedom and fairness, and everybody dropping their old, antiquated, stupid customs. Lots of these sort of well-meaning leftist types defend all these backwards cultures. Well, I don't at all. When I say I want to eliminate nationalism, that doesn't mean that I just want to mix all these different nations and cultures together. No, I just want to get rid of this entire notion of nation entirely, okay? And that involves also getting rid of culture. I want just a single, global, rational culture. And again, don't worry, it's not weird, It wouldn't be like modern liberal culture, because modern liberal culture has some weirdness. Because I know that especially Republicans, they're like, they're really afraid of this idea of New World Order, and they're just really, they're actually very nationalistic and really afraid of, loosening the borders at all. So obviously, I want to reassure these people that well, of course I do want to, remove borders entirely. That doesn't mean that I want to create the kind of society that you fear would arise if we did that. Overall, I actually think that my vision for society is pretty similar to what the Republican vision for society is. Though it's true in the past, lots of people might have been racist, and for sure we still have some racist people. By and large, I don't believe most Republicans are racist. What they are now is mostly tribalist, for their own party mostly, for their own ideology. Pretty much everything that Republicans do and believe in simply exists kind of in opposition to the Democratic Party. And to a certain extent, we could say the same about the Democratic Party. So sure, lots of Republican lawmakers have proposed bills that would restrict access to voting for black people, but it's not actually because they're black. It's because they're Democratic. They also restrict access to voting to college people. See, so they're not actually racist. They don't discriminate against black people in particular. They discriminate against Democrats. They're not racist, they're partyist. And of course, they consider themselves somewhat legitimized to do this because, well, for starters, it is actually legal. And of course, well, voter fraud can happen, and it does happen, and in each election there are a few rare instances of fraud. And of course, they know that the Democrats also cheat the system in their own way through immigration by letting in immigrants who will often tend to vote more for Democrats than Republicans. So they figure, well, the Democrats are doing that with immigration, well, we're going to do our thing with gerrymandering and voter restriction. And most Republican voters don't actually even realize that it's actually to restrict the Democratic vote. that this sort of tightening of voting is put in place, right? Most of them, I think, genuinely believe that there is fraud and that it's something that they're trying to fight. I think most Republicans actually believe in freedom and fairness and don't realize that often the Republican Party's positions actually serve to restrict freedom and fairness. I still like to think that most Republicans consider freedom and fairness as part of their most fundamental values. And since those are also my fundamental values, I'm hoping that they can see that what I'm proposing is not some sort of weird thing that goes against their values. Like, sure, it goes against nationalism, but nationalism is opposed to freedom and fairness. If you actually believe in the ideals that America is based on, or at least supposedly based on, well, you should want everyone to benefit from them, right? That was the ostensible idea of the Iraq War, right? We bring democracy to Iraq. And sure, like, there are all sorts of ulterior motives in during the Iraq War, and mostly, it was motivated out of self-interest, not out of promoting democracy. Because otherwise, well, the US would do the same to Saudi Arabia, or at least would certainly stop being allies with Saudi Arabia, right? But still, if we'd actually managed to implement democracy in Iraq, and if the Iraqis had actually been with it enough to have a properly functioning democracy, well, it would have definitely been worthwhile. But of course, then there'd be a bunch of other countries to invade as well. But the point I want to make is that wanting to spread the actual good American values like freedom and fairness, that is a good thing. So really, Americans shouldn't just entrench themselves and say, well, okay, we have our own good values, but we leave other people to their own misery and to their own stupid cultures. No, I think we should want to free other people from their oppressive cultures. That's what the missionaries did back in the day. And I think that's a very good idea from the moment that you accept the premise that Christianity is a good thing. Look, the American way of life is largely the closest to the way of life that I want to promote with my globalist anti-nationalism. It's not some weird hippie commie thing, okay? So, Americans, and more generally Western people, we're not going to let ourselves be swamped by these other cultures. No, we're going to turn these other cultures into Westerners. We're going to turn them into Americans. That is what I want. Bye.